All right, U.S. history to 1865. This section, this lecture this week is called "Colliding Cultures," and I want to say at the outset that your book has sort of better descriptions or richer sort of explanations of Native American culture than I do, and so I'm going to give you some of that, but I'm going to give you a lot of the background to the English exploration of North America and in fact to what happens to during this collision of cultures. You see here, I've chosen two pictures on this sort of home screen as a sort of arrival picture. This would be a late 1500s, early 1600s picture, and then this is much more. The one on the right is a picture an engraving from the late 1700s. Okay. I want to say at the outset that it's very important to remember that in the context of historians and historians' work, the terms Indian and Native American are more or less synonymous. As you may or may not know, early explorers thought that they were going to India, or early explorers from Europe thought they were going to India, and when they arrived, they encountered Native Americans, thought they were encountering Indians, and they called them such. And so that name sort of stuck and was used very often at the time. Whereas it's of course inaccurate, and we prefer to use Native American. But when it comes to talking history with historians and with ethnographers and anthropologists, Indian and Native American can be used synonymously. That does not mean that in contemporary American life, you'll find that people are as receptive to the word Indian as they used to be. They may not be. So I would always stick to Native American, but the fact that you're going to read the term Indian over and over and over again in your readings for this course doesn't mean that these books are out of date or that what I'm saying is out of date. Is because there is a specific sort of reason we use Indian, and that's because, of course, it was used at the time. Now, I'm saying all this while we're looking at a drawing from 1585, 1586 of an Indian or Native American village. This was done by an artist named John White, who spent a year on the Outer Banks of North Carolina in 1585-86 as part of an expedition sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh. Okay? And in this drawing, he shows an Indian village surrounded by a stockade. Now, it's not clear, obviously, how accurate this is. It's probably pretty accurate because the British explorers and British government wanted as much good information as they could get back in London. So, but it also tends to have a little bit of a European fort look to it. So we have to assume that White. We don't have to assume. You might assume that White was also thinking about traditional European fortifications and European village design. All right, England in the 17th century is a very, very important thing for us to understand. First of all, in the 16th century, the 1500s, England was a second-rate power in Europe, weakened by internal divisions, especially those between Protestants and Catholics. Okay. Once Henry VIII launched the Protestant Reformation in England by severing the nation from the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England, or Anglican Church, with himself at its head, things started to change. Although there was this tense period where Queen Mary came into power after Henry switched back to Catholicism, but it was after she died, Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled a very long time, 1558 to 1603, finally secured the power of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, not the Catholic Church, and successfully defended England from Catholic enemies on the continent, notably the Spanish, right, who had attempted, by the way, to invade in 1588 with a massive armada that was repulsed. Also, well into the 17th century, the 1600s, the English also attempted to subdue Ireland and its Catholic population, part through military conquest and part through the slaughter of civilians, clearing of civilians, seizure of land, and the introduction of English economic practices and colonization. And part because England was a more powerful nation or more powerful country than Ireland, and was able to throw its weight around more or less. The English expelled many Irish Catholics from land to make room for Protestant settlers. These were called plantations, especially the Elizabethan plantations of the plantations that happened under Queen Elizabeth. And the cultural practices and ideas that were defined and sort of honed and sharpened during England's colonization of Ireland really shaped its conquest of North America. So that's very, very, very important to keep in mind, the Irish aspect. Now, the other thing, of course, and don't forget, religion is perhaps the most important thing to understand, the most important cultural phenomenon in this period to understand. Only under Queen Elizabeth's reign did the English look to North America. Although at first they were more interested in raiding Spanish cities and treasure fleets than in actual colonization. Their first two colonies in Newfoundland and what became North Carolina were relatively small efforts that failed quickly. Humbert Gilbert, a man named Humbert Gilbert, who'd earned a brutal reputation in the Irish Wars, established a short-lived settlement in Newfoundland, and Sir Walter Raleigh established a settlement a few years later at Roanoke Island. The first group of settlers at Roanoke Island abandoned the colony and returned to England. The second group, composed of families, disappeared by the time a ship had returned to supply the colony, and with only the word Croatoan inscribed on a tree remaining, that's Croatoan, the colonists are assumed to have abandoned the settlement and gone to live with the Indians, gone to live with the Native Americans, right? That mystery has always plagued historians. Sir Walter Raleigh, discouraged by this outcome and financially strained, now realized that additional planning and more financial resources than one person could provide were necessary for the successful establishment of a colony. Now, as in the case with Spain, national glory, profit, and religious mission merged in early English thought about American colonization. The Reformation from Catholicism to Protestantism, had solidified Catholic Spain as England's mortal enemy, a stance that substantiated by a victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain claimed the spread of Catholicism as justification for their colonization, and England claimed to be there to liberate the New World from the tyranny of the Pope. So at least initially, it's about removing Spanish and Catholicism from the virgin, what they thought of as a virgin New World, and not so much the motivation that they wanted to overrun the New World on their own. And atrocities, of course, were not confined to one imperial nation, but the notion that the Spanish were uniquely cruel was very prominent. And that idea allowed those such as Raleigh and others to pitch the colonization idea to Elizabeth I as an effort, again, like I say, to free the New World from Spain, thus tying freedom and empire together. They pointed out, however, that glory and power were closely involved as well, because colonization would allow England to rival the larger continental powers, especially as Spain and France. This is a picture of Queen Elizabeth, right? The Armada portrait commemorates the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, right? And it appears to link it with English colonization of the New World. You see the defeat of Spain in the background and outside the window, and the Queen has her hand resting on a globe pointing towards the coast of North America. And here's an engraving of depicting colonists hunting and fishing in Virginia. These were promotional images, right? Produced in England to emphasize the abundance of the New World, especially when it came to game and farming, and suggested that colonies could live very familiar lives, very English-style lives there, but with a whole lot more abundance. Now, let me talk about the social dynamics in English North America. Some advocates argued that North America would absorb England's surplus population in a time of socioeconomic crisis and population growth. Colonization would drain away the urban poor and the peasants who'd been evicted from their own lands, and the commons by the enclosures of large landlords, this is explained in your book, and who seemed to English elites to threaten social order and stability. Under Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, the unemployed could be whipped, branded, hanged, or even forced to labor. Voluntary or involuntary emigration to the New World seems to have been an alternative that would simultaneously, in their mind, benefit the poor and the English nation and the English elites. In turn, images of America, such as the ones that appeared in Thomas More's Utopia, promoted the New World as a place of wealth and opportunity where men could escape the hierarchies and inequalities of Europe, gain economic independence by owning land, and rule themselves. These images appealed to ordinary Englishmen and encouraged them to risk migration to the Americas. The main lure for immigrants was not gold so much. That was more of a Spanish motivation, but rather the promise of independence connecting to owning land and the ability to pass that land on to children and descendants. All right, let me get more detail into emigration. Emigration was risky. Diseases, internal religious, political, economic tensions, and imperial wars and conflicts with the Indians all threatened the colonists with harm or death. They were dependent on England for protection and aid, and most settlements would have collapsed without such support and further immigration. Because economic conditions in England were so bad, more migrants in the 17th century, more than 500,000, left England than left France or Spain. Most of the English who came to North America were young, single men from the lower ranks of English society. Some settled in the tobacco-producing colonies of Virginia and Maryland, where labor demand was high, while the rest settled in New England and the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Many of these people had already moved around the country in England and got nowhere economically, so to speak. And so emigration represented an extension of an increasingly mobile English lifestyle. Settlers who could afford their own passage arrived as free persons and soon acquired land. In the 1600s, however, most Englishmen arrived as indentured servants who voluntarily surrendered their freedom for a period of time, 5 to 7 years, usually in exchange for passage to America. Now, indentured servants were not slaves. You'll often see a thing called the Irish slaves myth running around the internet. But they were bound to this contract, and the contract did kind of make them unfree. The contract could be bought and sold. They couldn't be these people couldn't marry without the owner's permission. In theory, they were subject to physical punishments, and they could not refuse to work. Unlike slaves, however, indentured servants, at least those who survived their term of labor, eventually became free and received freedom dues, sometimes including land. Okay. Now, there was a high death rate, and meager or unmet freedom dues meant that many colonists many indentured servants were kind of gypped, or I shouldn't say that. That's the wrong word to use. Had their promises taken away from them, and some colonies were more notorious for this than others, and they became less appealing. Okay. You see, for the English, land was the basis of liberty, allowing people to control, especially men, to control their own labor, and in most colonies, this owning land granted them the vote. The English crown also awarded land grants, sometimes quite extensive, to relatives and allies. Because land was so plentiful in North America, and so many English migrants, both free and indentured servants, came to America to gain land and the independence that came with it, property owners soon turned to African slaves as a labor force. The land available was so great in acreage that you couldn't possibly work it yourself in an awful lot of places on the North American continent, North American coast. Thus, liberty and slavery moved together sort of in parallel in early English America. Now, here's a pamphlet. I've always liked this pamphlet. This is actually, like I say, this is kind of modern advertising back in 1609. This is a pamphlet published in 1609 promoting emigration to Virginia, offering most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia. Exciting, all such blah 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 blah. You know, this is the New Britain, right? It is New Britain was, I think, the name of the ship, but it was also the name of the company that sought to gain immigrants. Okay, now this is one of these indentures that I talked about, contract of labor for a period of years. All right, and this was signed by James Mahoney, who emigrated from Ireland to North America in 1723. Okay, so indentured servants came from all over Britain and Ireland, right? And this was the kind of contract they lived and worked under for a certain period of time. All right, now, so we're talking about colliding cultures. Let me talk about the English and Native Americans. As you know, land in North America was occupied before the Europeans arrived. Far more settlers came to the English colonies than their Spanish and French counterparts, but this was a circumstance that was disastrous for American Indian communities and provoked recurrent warfare. The English did not call themselves conquerors because they were interested in land rather than dominion. They did not seek to rule or assimilate the Indian populations, but rather to remove them from the land desired by the settlers. Okay? Some intermingling occurred in various circumstances, but most English settlers remained obstinately separate from their Indian neighbors. Officially, the English denied the Indians rightful title to their lands because they did not cultivate or improve it. From a European's perspective, they did not do what was seen as European cultivation and improvement. In practice, colonial officials and settlers recognized occupancy as title, and they acquired land through purchase and forced treaties. While colonial governments attempted to regulate this process to keep the peace, few of their efforts were successful or enforced. The English settlers' demand for additional land continued to increase exponentially. The English developed a strong sense of superiority over the Native Americans, and as time went by, they made certain to keep boundaries between the two groups intact. The English would displace American Indian communities more thoroughly than any other empire. Though many Eastern Indians initially welcomed the English settlers, particularly for the goods they introduced to the native culture, such as cloth, metal tools, and guns, many Indians gradually came to resent the changes English colonization brought to Indian life. Men turned more to hunting beaver and fur trading, older skills, because those things were valuable for trade to European settlers. Older skills fell into disuse with the appearance of English technologies, and alcohol became common and disruptive. As the colonists developed a military advantage over the Indians, profits from the fur trade flowed mostly to colonial and European merchants. English colonists also introduced diseases that led to devastating epidemics for the Native American population. So English settlement transformed the land and its uses, threatening the Indians' way of life with fencing, with new crops, livestock such as pig and cattle. By the way, that livestock often trampled Indian crops, and the depletion of forest to supply wood for the English domestic market also took a toll on Indians' hunting practice. Okay, this is a drawing by the artist John White showing 10 male and female Native Americans dancing around a circle of posts in a religious ritual in what is now North Carolina. Okay, White was the reason why historians sort of look to White for these depictions. He seemed to be a very careful observer of their clothing and body markings, and to be careful about depicting the objects used in the ceremony. Okay, and this is the only known contemporary portrait of a New England Indian. This is a 1681 painting by an unknown artist of an influential Pequot leader and friend of John Winthrop II, who was the governor of colonial Connecticut, he originally owned the painting. Okay. Now, apart from the wampum beads around his neck, right? Everything else he wears is of English manufacture, the boots and everything else. Okay, the first real place to look at is Jamestown, first permanent English settlement in the world, founded in 1607 by the private Virginia Company. Okay. At first, the colony, intended as a means to discover gold or other precious materials, was plagued by internal divisions, high death rate, and difficulty getting supplies from England. And while the colonists' hopes for quick riches were soon dashed, few had any experience with agriculture. This led to starvation, which, when compounded by disease and illness, led to a high death rate. Few initial settlers survived the first year, and only military discipline imposed by a former soldier, one John Smith, who you've probably heard of, actually saved the colony. Now, to become viable and attract settlers, the Virginia Company stopped looking for gold, started to grow its own food and a marketable commodity, and created an elective representative assembly. The company awarded land to those who paid their own or others' passage under what was called the headright system, and introduced a charter of grants and liberties, which included the creation of something called the House of Burgesses, the first assembly elected in colonial America. And by the way, only landowners could vote, so don't get the idea that everybody was voting. The arrival in 1619 of the first 20 Africans in Virginia marked, along with the meeting of the House of Burgesses that year, sort of the co-joined development of freedom and slavery in English America. Thus, the foundation was laid for an economy dominated by slave-owning planters. This is a map of English settlement in the Chesapeake, right, which already spread way beyond, by this period, by 1640, beyond the initial colony of Jamestown. Tobacco planters sought fertile land near navigable waterways. Okay, and these things are relatively isolated from each other. The English settlement in the Chesapeake is relatively isolated from the eventual settlements in New England, and thus relatively isolated from the settlements in the Caribbean area. Okay, now there was, as you might imagine, American Indian resistance. The area where the English established Jamestown was inhabited by some 15,000 to 25,000 American Indians living in agricultural communities. Okay. The Indian leaders soon realized the advantages of trade with the English, but they were also worried that these were possible invaders. Now, the Virginia Company, remember I mentioned that a few slides ago, that they instructed colonists to treat indigenous inhabitants kindly and attempt to convert them to Christianity. John Smith, however, realized that the colonists were dependent on Indians for food, and therefore attempted to negotiate in a way that kept trade open. The first 2 years were mostly peaceful. However, at some point, Smith was captured by Powhatan, the Native American leader, threatened with execution, and rescued by the leader's daughter, Pocahontas. Okay, now, legend portrays Pocahontas as a rebellious teenager in life. The incident was a rebellious teenager in love. Sorry, the incident was most likely an elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate Powhatan's power. Okay, not the sort of Disney-fied version that you may have seen. Now, relations deteriorated after Smith returned to England, and colonists massacred villagers indiscriminately, and Pocahontas was captured only to convert to Christianity and marry John Rolfe, R-O-L-F, as part of a peace settlement. She went to England with Rolfe and became a sensation. She was supposed to represent Anglo-American harmony, and she lived there until she died in 1687. And by the way, her father, Powhatan, died in 1675? She dies in 1617, and Powhatan dies in 1618. Sporadic fighting lasted between the Indians and the Jamestown colonists until 1614, but the peace declared that year was broken by Powhatan's successor. whose surprise attack wiped out nearly 1/4 of Virginia's small settler population. Jamestown survivors retaliated by massacring scores of Indians and destroying their villages. The English now held the balance of power in the colony, and the Virginia, which soon became the first royal colony of England, named after the Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, began to stabilize and slowly increase its population, in part by turning to the cultivation of tobacco. The Native Americans led a last attack in 1644, killing roughly 500 colonists, but ultimately that ended in defeat, and it ended with a treaty requiring Indians to leave the area. The policy of separation, which is the policy that had been set as a precedent in Ireland. Here is John Smith, leader of the early Virginia colony in 1624. This is the only known portrait of Pocahontas during her lifetime, 1616. It's actually a copy of an earlier version. Right? She took the name Rebecca, by the way, after converting to Christianity. And this is Powhatan, the most prominent Indian leader in the original English settlement of Virginia. Right? Here's an engraving of that 1622 uprising in Virginia that depicts Native Americans massacring defenseless colonists. Right, this is very much a European engraving, and it has that that sort of slant to it. Okay, now let me talk about economics and social structure. With more Europeans smoking tobacco, the crop became a lucrative basis for the Virginia colony's survival and growth. Soon a plantation elite, and again there's that word plantation. Plantation keeps coming up again. That plantation elite with large estates emerged, and that who ruled Virginia's society and politics. And they turned from unreliable and temporary white servant labor, mainly indentured servant contract labor, to black slave labor. Virginia's white society came to resemble that of England, with landed gentry at the top, small farmers in the middle, and an army of poor laborers at the bottom. Okay. Given the demand for male servant labor in the tobacco fields, men at first vastly outnumbered women in the colony, and various factors contributed to late marriage and a low rate of family formation. Although women in Virginia, as in England, had few legal rights, conditions in the colonies kind of gave women roles they could not assume in the mother country. Widows and unmarried women embraced their right to conduct business, to make contracts, and even sometimes administer estates. But most white women arrived in Virginia as indentured servants, often subject to hard labor and, frankly, sexual abuse from their masters. This is again, I keep bringing up these advertisements that were shown back in England. Okay, this is an advertisement for tobacco that includes images of slaves handling barrels and tobacco plants. And this is an engraving of Englishmen in a tavern smoking tobacco. Okay. As tobacco caught on pretty quickly after, first of all, seeming like a very bizarre thing to do. But in European, demand for tobacco really enriched not only the planters in Virginia, but British merchants and the English governments. And of course, it's very, very labor intensive, manual labor intensive. There isn't a sort of hierarchy of managers and skilled work and everything like there is in later in the Industrial Revolution. So there's an ever increasing demand for field labor. Now, just up from Virginia is Maryland. Maryland, like Virginia, was a tobacco colony. It was established later in 1632 by King Charles I as a proprietary colony, right, of Cecilius Calvert. Calvert ruled Maryland like a feudal domain, controlling its trade and the decisions of its elected assembly, despite the charter's guarantee of giving ordinary Maryland colonists all the rights and privileges of Englishmen. Now, Calvert was a Catholic. He also saw Maryland as a refuge for persecuted fellow Catholics in England, and at first he hoped Catholics and Protestants could live in harmony there, but Protestants, mostly indentured or former servants, soon outnumbered Catholics, and their frustration mounted as they'd faced diminishing opportunities for land ownership in the latter half of the 17th century. Here is an engraving of tobacco processing. It shows that the labor intensivity of it. Slaves in the background, female indentured servants work with the crop after it's been harvested. Now, I've talked about those middle Atlantic colonies, talk about that Chesapeake area. Now I want to talk about the development of New England. Whereas Virginia and Maryland quickly became societies dominated by a small aristocracy ruling over many bound laborers, New England colonial society evolved differently. Early New England was decisively shaped by Puritans, who were a diverse group of English Protestants united in their belief that the Anglican Church retained too many of the practices and doctrines of the old Catholic Church. Okay? They were mainly, these Protestants were called Congregationalists. They rejected the Catholic and Anglican structures of religious authority that again the Church of England retained, archbishops, bishops, priests, and instead embraced independent local congregations that chose their own clergy, determined their own mode of worship, and often listened to sermons by educated ministers, and often they personally studied the Bible. Okay. Like many Anglicans, however, Puritans shared a hatred of Catholicism and celebrated England's greatness and devotion to liberty. As followers of John Calvin's theology, the Puritans believed God had predestined different groups of people, the elect, to be saved from damnation. No amount of good deeds or good works could save those who are not among the elect. Okay. Now, when a minority of Puritans in England separated from the Church of England, some of those Puritans decided to emigrate to America in order to fully practice their Protestant faith away from the influence and control of the Anglican Church and the English government that still enforced its rules. One leader of the Puritan immigrants who settled in Massachusetts Bay, named John Winthrop, helped found a, quote, city set upon a hill, unquote, where Puritans would reject natural liberty or action without restraints that he believed were typically practiced by Irish, Indians, bad Christians. They would reject that in favor of moral liberty to do, quote, that only which is good, end quote. Okay, in which the Puritans became free by accepting severe restraints on speech, religion, and personal behavior. Why we get the word someone's being puritanical. Okay. This is the first book printed in the English mainland colonies. The whole book of Psalms, faithfully translated into English meter, was published in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640. Worshippers used it to sing psalms, which were religious songs from the Bible, sung in Massachusetts, unaccompanied by music because the Puritans churches had banned the music. Okay. So who are these? Then who are these people? Right, I've talked about them as Puritans, right, and I need to explain that a little before. They're what we call and what have been called the Pilgrims. They were the first Puritan settlers to America. They were separatists who left the Netherlands in 1620. Financed by private investors who were interested in establishing a trading base in North America. They wanted to settle in Virginia, but their ship, the Mayflower, was blown off course and landed on Cape Cod. Now, before the survivors of the journey established the Plymouth colony there, they drew up the famous Mayflower Compact. Not the Mayflower Contract, the Mayflower Compact, in which all adult male colonists agreed to obey just and equal laws enacted by representatives of their own choosing. This was the first written frame of government in what became the United States. Resting on the consent of all members of the colony, their government did not restrict voting to church members, and all land was held in common until it was divided up in 1627. In 1691, this independent colony became an official crown colony of England. Although earlier visits by Europeans had brought diseases that devastated the local Indian population, these Indians, including the notable Squanto, helped the Puritans at Plymouth survive their first winter by offering them food, and which is a relationship that was celebrated at the first Thanksgiving in 1621. That first Thanksgiving doesn't last past 1621, but it's something that Americans harken back to. So chartered in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was formed by London merchants hoping to further the Puritan cause and profit by trade with the Native Americans. And that year, it sent immigrants who settled in Massachusetts Bay north of Plymouth. By 1642, a great migration of 21,000 Puritans had flowed to Massachusetts Bay. And although migration to New England really dwindled soon thereafter, compared to the colonists in the Chesapeake, we just talked about, settlers in New England were older, more prosperous, and more religious. Fewer New England colonists were settlers, and here women were just as numerous as men, resulting in more families than in the southern colonies. And although only a small fraction of migrants went to New England during the early 17th century, by 1700, the white population was 91,000, larger than that in the Chesapeake or in the West Indies and the Caribbean. Nearly all were descendants of those who crossed the Atlantic during the Great Migration. Here's an early 17th century engraving showing the English explorer Bartholomew Gosnold encountering Native Americans. He landed at Cape Cod in 1602 and established a small outpost there. And the region's Indians had much experience with Europeans. So this shows the region's Indians had much experience with Europeans before the Pilgrims settled there. And this is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, the Indians' scanty attire suggests lack of civilization. And what it says here, the statement, which you maybe can make out, says, he's saying, "Come over and help us." Okay. This is, by the way, based on an incident from the Bible. And it illustrated the English conviction that they were liberating the native population rather than exploiting it. Puritanism was a much more all-encompassing thing than what was experienced in the mid-Atlantic colonies. In New England, families and the patriarchal authority of the Puritan husband and fathers defined colonial society. These adult men controlled the labor of women and children in a farming society without large numbers of slaves or indentured servants. Although women were held to be spiritual equals to men and could become full members of the church, women were legally subservient to male authority in the home. The average New England woman married young, gave birth 7 times, and spent most of her life bearing and raising children. The Puritans feared excessive individualism and social disorder and organized themselves into small, compact, self-governing towns centered on a congregational church and eventually on a school, the school was mostly for learning how to read the Bible, surrounded by small houses and farming lots for individual families. The colony's government reflected this religious and social vision. The Massachusetts Bay Company's shareholders transformed their commercial charter into a government document. Okay. And at first they chose the colony's rulers, but in 1634, deputies elected by the freemen, who were landowning church members, constituted a single legislature, the General Court. 10 years later, company officers and elected deputies were divided into 2 legislative houses, and unlike in Virginia or Maryland, freemen were able to elect their own governor. The principle of consent was central to all Puritan life, including both church and state, but Puritan democracy, especially voting in colony-wide elections, was limited to members of the church, which was an ever smaller number, right, as the colony grew over time. This was a hierarchical society in which families of social prominence were assigned the best land and the most desirable seats in church, actually in the church itself. Divisions were also established in such areas such as attire and language for addressing one another, right? Inequality was considered God's will. Some liberties applied to all, but separate ideas separate ideas were applied to different groups, and the body of liberties allowed slavery, with the first slave appearing in the records in 1640. Ministers were not allowed to hold office, public office, but church and state were very closely connected. Each town was required to have a tax-supported church. Church courts were not established, but the state enforced religious matters. Freedom of speech and assembly were provided for, but really, straying from the prescribed religious behavior held severe consequences, including the death penalty. Puritans believed religious uniformity to be vital to social order, and that toleration of dissent disrupted that order. Religious liberty meant the liberty to structure society based on that notion. The desire of some congregations for local autonomy, however, soon clashed with notions of uniformity. This is a painting of the Savage family, a 1779 painting of New England artist. By the way, Edward Savage is the painter, and he depicts several generations of his family here. Okay, and so that's a little bit later than what we're talking about, but it shows the concentration on family life and family hierarchy and the development of family genealogy over time. This is an embroidered banner depicting the main building at Harvard, the first college established in the English colonies. It was probably made by a Massachusetts woman for her husband or son who attended Harvard, but we don't know that for sure. Now, again, New Englanders and religion, it's not just all Puritans. Things are very not complicated, but they're much more interesting than just Puritans and the whole spiel about Puritans I just gave. They respected individual judgments, the Puritans did. They disdained, however, individualism and considered too much emphasis on the self to be dangerous to social harmony and stability. So in the region's compact towns, you see, residents monitored each other, and they punished or ostracized those who violated communal norms. Dissenters were not so much free to dissent as they were free to leave the Puritan community if they transgressed Puritan social and religious norms. Now, Roger Williams, a dissenter, suggested that Massachusetts Bay should separate church and state. And he argued that his congregation should withdraw from the Anglican Church, and he also rejected the conviction that the Puritans were an elect people on a divine mission to spread the true Protestant faith. His intention was to strengthen religion rather than weaken it, and he believed that government was corrupted, that government corrupted the purity of religion. So he's banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. So he and his followers founded Rhode Island, which became a beacon of religious freedom with no established church or religious qualifications for voting. Now, other religious dissenters went on to found colonies of Hartford and colonies of New Haven. Eventually, in 1662, they become united to become the colony of Connecticut. And the Puritan establishment actually found one dissenter named Anne Hutchinson particularly threatening, both because she was a woman and because of her influence with other colonists. She argued that inner grace, not just church attendance or moral behavior, determined who could be a member of the saved Puritan elect. He was denounced by church and state authorities for antinomianism, which is putting one's own judgment or faith above human law and church teaching. Hutchinson was put on trial and banished from the colony, so her family moved to Rhode Island. Well, eventually most of them died in an Indian war. But Hutchinson, Williams, and dissenters demonstrated that Puritan belief in individual interpretation of the Bible could lead to a challenge in the church structure. Okay? However, many years passed before religious toleration became part of Massachusetts society. Many years. This is an engraving of Roger Williams. And if you go to New England, go to Rhode Island, you see there's a Roger Williams College or university, and a lot of things are named for Roger Williams. Okay. This is a map of English settlement in New England around 1640. So you see that by the mid-17th century, English settlement in New England had spread well inland and up and down the Atlantic coast. Okay, let me talk about Puritans on American Indians. Puritans who recognized, by the way, Indians' claim to the land and sought to acquire it through purchase also tended to see Indians as savages and heathens, similar to Catholics, because they thought they had deceptive rituals and worshipped false gods. Now, afraid that undisciplined Indian life might attract some colonists, Puritan New Englanders hoped to prevent their fellow Englishmen from joining native tribes by passing punitive laws and publishing narratives of captivity, promoting Christian life in the colony. Although the Puritans rhetorically advocated the conversion of Indians to Christianity, they really, initially anyway, made few efforts to actually do so. So as the white populations of New England increased, so did tensions with the region's Native Americans. In 1637, colonists responded to the murder of a fur trader by a few members of the Pequots, which is, again, a powerful tribe in southern New England that had controlled the fur trade. The colonists responded by destroying a Pequot village at Mystic in Connecticut, massacring some 500 men, women, and children. And the Pequots' defeat led to further white settlement in western New England and intimidated local Native Americans into quiescence for nearly 4 decades. Here is a title page of a translation of the Bible into the Massachusetts Indian language, published by John Eliot in 1663. Okay. Now remember, the publishing of, and the translating of the Bible from Latin into English was still a relatively new thing, less than 100 years old. So then publishing it further into a Native American language was quite a development. And here's the destruction of a Pequot village in 1637. Okay, this is the one on the Mystic River in 1637, told me. The colonial forces firing guns, and they actually have Native American allies who are against the Pequots. So there was a good some cooperation, sort of cross-cultural cooperation there. So it's very, very, very complicated, but is almost always very savage. When push came to shove, it was often easier for any one of these groups to attack another group rather than try to reach accommodations. Okay, now let me talk about very, very important stuff. The New England economy and the religious compromise. Now, although Puritan leaders celebrated religion as their primary motive for emigrating to America, profit and prosperity remained central to many Puritans' decisions to go to New England. Many were well off in England but lived in economically depressed areas, and they sought opportunity in the New World, especially in the form of land ownership or a craft. While many New Englanders made a living by exporting fish and timber to Europe, most survived on subsistence family farming and the small surpluses this produced. Compared to southern colonies, in New England there were fewer slaves and fewer indentured servants. Although New Englanders were not as wealthy sort of individually as colonists in the Chesapeake region, wealth was distributed more equally than in Virginia or Maryland. But economic development was soon accompanied by social inequality, with a growing number of wage earners and a merchant elite profiting from an expansive trade in goods between the West Indies, Europe, and Africa. This economic growth and increasing commercialization worried some Puritan leaders, with fewer members of the Massachusetts colony being eligible for church membership. So the Halfway Covenant of 1662 was designed to solve this problem by enabling third-generation Puritans, those least likely to have met the conversion standard of church membership, to become church members merely because they were descendants of the original Puritan settlers. Okay. By the late 17th century, ministers were excoriating colonists for violations such as selfishness, pride, violation of the Sabbath, right? And these ministers had these lengthy sermons called Jeremiads, and sometimes you'll hear that term even used today. A sort of lengthy scolding speech is called the Jeremiad. This is a self-portrait of Thomas Smith, who was a sailor who came to to New England from Bermuda. Around 1650, he acquired considerable wealth, which is shown in his fashionable clothing. And the background, by the way, depicts a naval battle involving Dutch and English ships, possibly a reference to their joint attack on a North African port in 1670. And the foreground is a poem with Smith's initials. This is the earliest known American self-portrait. And here we have a painting called Mrs. Elizabeth Freake, Freake, and Baby Mary. Painted by an anonymous artist in the 1670s, this portrait depicts the wife and daughter of John Freake, prominent Boston merchant. Right? In order to illustrate the family's wealth, Mrs. Freake wears a triple strand of pearls, a garnet bracelet, and a gold ring, and the child wears a yellow silk dress. Okay. By 1600, the traditional view of English liberties as a set of privileges limited to a certain social group was competing with the notion that certain rights of Englishmen applied to everyone in the kingdom. This latter tradition rested on the Magna Carta of 1215, in which the king had given rights to, quote, all free men in England, including protection against arbitrary imprisonment and the seizure of property without due process of law. But over time, this document came to signify a particularly English freedom, embodied in common law rights such as habeas corpus, trial by jury, whereas the king was subject to the rule of law and all persons enjoyed security of their own person and property. As the serfdom characteristic of feudalism receded, increasing numbers of Englishmen were considered free-born, therefore, and entitled to these rights. This, by the way, is the Court of Common Pleas. This is trial by jury, which is central element of English liberty. This is a much later drawing. This comes from 1808, right? But it's not all that different from what it would have looked like in the mid 1700s. Mid 1600s, sorry, or mid 1700s too. Now here we have to get to the English Civil War. This is an extremely important thing for the North American colonies. Obviously very important for England, but it was also very important for the North American colonies. Political and religious divisions within 17th century England heightened the meaning and importance of freedom there and in the colonies. The belief in freedom as a common English heritage and the British Empire as the world's guardian of liberty helped to legitimize colonization in the Western Hemisphere and cast imperial war against Catholic rivals as a struggle between freedom and tyranny. The struggle for political supremacy between Parliament and the Stuart monarchs, James I, Charles I, culminated in the 1640s in the English Civil War. Now, disputes over how and to what degree the Church of England should distance itself from Catholicism, and struggles over the respective powers of Parliament and the King, including, by the way, the powers of the King's power to impose taxes without Parliament's consent, provoked a military conflict that ended in victory for the pro-parliamentary forces, ended in the abolition of the monarchy, temporarily, and the execution of King Charles I. The victors established a, quote, commonwealth and free state ruled by Oliver Cromwell that lasted almost a decade. That didn't work. In the long run, in 1660, the monarchy was restored and Charles II assumed the throne. Okay, but political strife and upheaval in England in these years produced a rigorous debate about liberty that expanded the boundaries and definitions of freedom. The writer John Milton, for instance, great poet, called for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Some religious sects emerged that called for universal Protestant toleration. A movement called the Levelers proposed a written constitution abolishing both the monarchy and the House of Lords and extending the franchise, that is the right to vote, to those without much property. A more radical group called the Diggers advocated the common ownership of land. Although although levelers and diggers were quickly suppressed, some of their ideas were carried to America by English immigrants. This is the frontispiece of Leviathan, which is a book written by Thomas Hobbes. It was written during the English Civil War, published in 1651, after the execution of Charles I. It argues that the only effective form of government is absolute monarchy. And by the way, Hobbes designed this image himself to illustrate his thesis. The king wields the sword of justice in one hand and the staff of the archbishop in the other. He combines the powers of church and state. His person is composed of his people. He is literally a body politic. Beneath him is a peaceful, orderly country, and beneath that, images of threats to public order, both secular and religious, against the king, against which the king must guard. A very, very strong representation of the belief in absolute monarchy. Okay, now I mentioned a minute ago this English Civil War in America. Okay. While most New Englanders sided with the Parliament, sided with parliamentary forces in the 1640s, many Puritan leaders in the colonies were leery of those revolutionaries and the commonwealths, the succeeding government, leery of their tolerance for religious dissent. When followers of Anne Hutchinson became Quakers, right, a radical and spiritually egalitarian Protestant sect in England that defied Puritan doctrines, Massachusetts leaders tried to suppress them by banishment, by whipping, by hanging. And after the restoration of the monarchy, Charles II reaffirmed the charter and ordered the toleration of the Protestants. Executions ceased, but other efforts to suppress the Quakers continued. Now, during the English Civil War, Virginia sided with Charles I, and then it fell under Cromwell's control. In Maryland, the Civil War exacerbated pre-existing conflict between Catholics and Protestant settlers and anti-proprietary settlement, which fed a civil war within that colony. Now remember, Calvert, the head of that colony, stabilized Maryland, attracted more settlers by empowering Protestants in the colony's government and by guaranteeing religious toleration of all Christians, lessening the sort of the Catholic nature of Maryland. Under Cromwell and the Commonwealth, England adopted aggressive policies to expand its colonies, to promote Protestantism, and to empower commerce in the British Isles and the New World. Cromwell's army obviously extended English control in Ireland, in the process massacring civilians, banning Catholicism, seizing Catholic land. England also seized the valuable sugar island of Jamaica and passed the Navigation Acts in 1651, which was intended to challenge the commercial supremacy of the Dutch. And what it did was it limited England's colonial trade to English ships and English ports. And the Navigation Acts lasted forever, by the way. But we'll talk about that later in the course. Now, just to wrap up here, this is a scene in England, but it's important for America too. This is a meeting of the General Council of the Army at Putney, scene of a debate in 1647 over liberty and democracy between the Levelers and the more conservative Army officers. Levelers on your right there, and the Army officers on the left. Okay, so at exactly the same time that English colonies in North America were sort of trying to determine what kind of government they would have, that similar debates were going on in England. And of course, this is famous execution of Charles I, right, in 1649, that central event in the English Civil War. We'll talk about how all this develops further in the United States next week.